I think what I like so much about Mushroom Blues, I haven't read it, of course, but just reading through this right here, um, I like that it's grounded in that kind of detective, that's the part that is like, I understand that from without reading it.
Yep.
And so then the rest of it can be really wacky and different and out there or whatever. But because it's got that element, it's like, it works. You know what I mean?
Yeah, this is exactly something that I realized not while I was writing it, but when I spoke to Stephen Orion. He's an author, but he also does video interviews on his YouTube channel. So I was talking to him about it, and he just kind of brought up genre and sort of this relationship that the familiar and the unfamiliar can kind of play in a story. And he has his own stories where, you know, it's like a fantasy, but it's a police procedural. And so it just got me thinking about like as I mentioned earlier, the foundation of this world, or this particular story is rooted in police procedural and murder mystery, noir, these things that people are very familiar with and can really easily latch on to as like a selling point. Even like a lot of people really love detective stories, they really love murder mysteries, what have you. And so by kind of laying that foundation, I was able to kind of ground the reader as much as I was able to ground the protagonist. I was also able to ground the reader in the familiarity of the certain beats that these genres have. You know, like you open the book, first chapter, there's a crime scene, there's a murder. How is the protagonist going to solve this? Then along the way, it's like you have very familiar beats in terms of, you know, meeting with the superior officer at the precinct, or interrogations, you know, like a car chase, investigations and searching for clues, and then kind of like questioning people, interviewing perps and all that kind of stuff. Those things are there, and they're spaced in such a way where it's consistently kind of pulling you back into, or like pulling you down into the familiar earth of this genre that you know and love.
Yeah.
But along the way, I'm able to introduce really weird stuff, like all of the fungal world building, the fungal people and their biology and their society, their ways of communicating, body horror and like really gross stuff about mushrooms, really beautiful things about mushrooms as well, psychedelics, and sort of like more surreal aspects, but also the peculiarities of individual characters and the things that they're able to bring to the table. And so that balance was something that I did unconsciously, but I think it really works. Like I got an email from my aunt recently, and you know, she's a writer as well. And she's working on self-publishing her first book. Based on what she's seen of my experience, she saw that it was viable to do it this way. And she doesn't read science fiction or fantasy, but she read my book and said that those were the elements. The detective, she loves detective stories. That aspect of the story kept her kind of comfortable enough to keep going.
Yeah.
Even though so many of the other aspects of it were like making her feel sort of like queasy and uncomfortable, still engaged, but you're kind of grappling with the uncanny in a lot of ways. But if you have something familiar like a detective framework, that can keep you going.
Yeah, it makes me think a lot about how much, you know, people really do get stuck. I mean, I'm like this. Like, you really stuck in like, this is how a genre should be, or how something should be, or an idea. You know, my book is, what I'm working on is based kind of in a more like a Tolkien type of world with elves and dwarves and all that. And I love that stuff. And like, that's definitely where I want to keep it. But like, now I'm thinking, have I added enough maybe other genres to this? Like, is there a different angle I could come at it from? Because like you said, I think because you've added this detective element in, people who just like detective books but don't like fantasy may still pick it up and still enjoy it just as much.
Exactly. It's like the reader is not going to, if it's done effectively, the reader is not going to be bombarded with the fact that you're blending genres. But you as a writer can consciously choose genres, and even like I would even say like this blending can go as deep as the world itself and the setting, and approaching something as familiar as like a Tolkien-esque world, where you have orcs and elves and goblins and all that kind of stuff. But the framework of the story, even though like the world elements and races and things like that might be familiar, you can bring in like another genre and blend that in there in order to give a fresh framework for something that is familiar to people. And so you can do a lot of cool stuff there. And I just love genre blending. Like, I think some of my favorite stuff is genre blending. And most people, when they hear the term genre blending, they've, like, especially from a consumer standpoint, they've probably never even thought about it. It's just this seamless thing that the craftspeople have been able to implement in their work, such that the blending of genres becomes an invisible driver for the entirety of the story.
Yeah. It's making me think about, have you watched Brandon Sanderson's lectures on YouTube? I'm assuming you probably have. It's been a minute since I watched him, but I remember him, doesn't he talk somewhere in there about like using archetypes and how like certain archetypes have like the hero has certain beats that like this is what the hero goes through.
Yeah.
And then what he does is kind of just like picks a bunch of different archetypes and then he kind of blends the beats. Like he just mixes it all up, and it's kind of making me think of that whole process. But
yeah, I mean, it doesn't even necessarily have to be just genre. Like, yeah, you can take something like the hero's journey and have that be your narrative framework. But along the way, it's like you can mix that with, like a unique world or different genres that are still working within the sort of like lattice of the hero's journey. But along the way, what you can do is you can still have those beats, but you can flip them on its head. You can subvert certain things, or you can approach it from a different angle that ends up satisfying the reader based on the beat that they expect unconsciously, sort of like based on all the stuff that they've consumed. And at the same time, give them like a big surprise. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like the interrogation in Mushroom Blues was one of like the coolest and most challenging parts of the book for me to write, because interrogations are so rote in a lot of ways. Like they're tried and true, but you don't necessarily see too many reinventions of the interrogation scene. You know, you have the common like good cop, bad cop. The one of the cops getting fed up with the perp and getting really aggressive and like grabbing them by the collar, that kind of stuff. So for me, it's like I was able to use my world and the sort of like the fungal biology that I'd created in order to give people that familiarity of the interrogation, but completely flip it on its head and make it a really shocking and uncomfortable moment. Yeah. And so there are ways that you can work that into genre beats and tropes. There are ways that you can work that into archetypes, character archetypes, and sort of expectations of what a certain character is going to do in order to fulfill a certain goal. And at the same time, you can work that into narrative frameworks like the hero's journey, etc.